Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Las Lajas Honey Yellow Diamond Processed Costa Rica from Mock Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Mock, based out of Brussels, Belgium. And they were a suggestion to us by Yokata. So shout outs to and thank you to Yokata for the suggestion. This is their first ever appearance on this channel, as I had zero familiarity with them going into this review. However, I do have a fair bit of familiarity with this coffee, the Las Lajas, as it is a coffee we have reviewed a number of times over the years. And it's safe to say it's not necessarily my favorite coffee in the entire world. However, it has been over a year since we last reviewed one, so this felt like the perfect opportunity to revisit it, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, as I always say, it's a little bit more difficult to tell when it comes to these more processed coffees. This one is definitely the lightest Las Lajas that we've ever reviewed on this channel. However, it's not necessarily an overly light coffee, as it does have a slight bit of development to it, while at the same time having a fair bit of brightness as well. So it's definitely on the more kind of moderate light side, as it definitely still is skewed a little bit more light, if not necessarily overly light. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression, and the coffee immediately reminded me of previous Las Lajas experiences, and Las Lajas essentially reminds me of red raspberry seeds with a heavy bit of fermentiness. Now this one did not have the same sort of heavy fermenty aspects on the first impression. At the same time though, it also had a lot of those very strong red fruit characteristics, so definitely reminded me of previous Las Lajas coffees. However, it did have a sweeter contrasting citric component to it, as well as a little bit of brightness, so there was a slight bit more depth to this one, and as a result, it left a better than expected first impression. Day 23, ran it through the Chemex, and it was significantly more Las Lajas-like through the Chemex, as it lacked the same clarity as the previous day, while at the same time kind of honing those red berry aspects yet again, as that was complemented by the graining component that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of, something I typically experience with Las Lajas as well. So that's not necessarily the most clean cup, with a contrasting citric brightness that wasn't quite as well defined, didn't necessarily leave the best second impression. On day 25, back through the V60, and significant improvement from the previous day, as the cup continues to come out at this time a little bit more candied, as a lot of those red fruit aspects come out slightly more candied, and the finish itself does have a little bit more candied, kind of caramel of a finish within the coffee as it does cool down. So for that reason, it was the best I'd experienced of this coffee up to this point, and I was seeing it trend in a nice direction. Day 28, ran it through the April dripper, and the coffee is the best it's been up to this point. And honestly, if I had enough filters, I would probably continue with this coffee through the April dripper, as it basically made the entire coffee a little bit more candied in terms of not just the berry fruit that I was experiencing, but also the citric aspect to it. Best day by far to this point, came out a little bit more balanced all around, so really enjoyed that day. Day 31, back through the V60, and it continues to skew back on the darker red fruit side of things, as the listed red plum does seem apt, but it's one of those things where I kind of have to prime myself, I kind of have to convince myself, because I just see this coffee as being more red raspberry seed than red plum. I think it may be a little bit difficult to differentiate between those two flavor profiles within the Las Lajas anyway, as I've seen both of those things listed on there. For me, just a little bit more kind of red raspberry seed than red plum. There is a nice bit of fresh fruit sweetness to it, and that's why I could see the plum as it does cool. Also a little bit of spice, so there's a little bit more depth to this one in general, and that's making for a slightly more interesting drink with this one. Day 34, through the Chemex, and the cup remains solid regardless of which brew method, even if it is slightly less clean through the V60, as there is a little bit of that candied sweet aspect. Yet again, a lot of the red fruit components with the sweeter citric, slightly more clean than expected, but overall just pretty solid through this brew method. Just definitely enjoying it a lot more through the V60. And I stuck with the V60 from that point going forward, as on day 36, it continued to feel very much on the red fruit side of things, regardless of which brew method. However, it's really dominating the cup, and at this time in a slightly more candied sense. So I was seeing it turn from a more kind of heavier fruit sweetness to a much more kind of candied sweetness, which was a nice positive for me. Citric brightness still present with a slight bit of herbality, but not bad overall. I kind of like the way it contrasted the very strong red fruits in this coffee. Day 39 continues to remain consistent, especially with a cool down. That's one thing I really want to emphasize is this coffee does improve as you let it cool down quite a bit. Very Las Lajas-esque. I can definitely tell this is a Las Lajas coffee as those red aspects remain on the forefront, not just in terms of a fruit component, but also in terms of a floral component, as that kind of spice herbality definitely reminds me of a hibiscus, which is something I associate with this coffee a lot. Seemingly reminiscent yet again of that red raspberry seed, the most dominant and important aspect I wanted to highlight within this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 5 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. We'll start with the finish, level 4. That's fine. It is definitely pushing a little on the high side of that level 4 mark. However, my previous experiences with Las Lajas coffees have been that the finish is too long lasting and too overbearing. This one right here with a slightly more candied finish is positive enough to the sense that while it still remains on the higher side of that finish, it's not overbearing. So I'm happy with it there at that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, and on the earlier days, it was a little kind of fruit sweet heavy. However, given that it's a little bit more candied sweet towards the end, I like it there at that level 4 mark. This one's also kind of pushing it, and not necessarily my favorite type of sweetness in general, as I don't love the red fruit sweetness, but it definitely does justify that at the minimum, slightly on the higher side of level 4, but not too overbearing there either. Acidity, level 4. Yes, it has a fair bit of brightness to it as well, so that goes kind of contrast to all of the other things within this coffee, as it feels kind of secondary, maybe even tertiary some points. It's a little bit of this kind of citric brightness to the cup, which is the second most defining characteristic in this coffee, the citrus, so I can definitely see a fair bit of brightness. Level 4 feels pretty right for this coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. I've been kind of discussing this the entire review, and for this coffee, it reminds me a lot more of red raspberries than it does red plums. So I had to make a determination as to which one I wanted to chart at the level 4. And for me, it was the berry fruit, and it's not overbearing, too heavy as previous Las Lajas coffees have been. So I'm very happy with it being there at that level 4 mark. And the citrus is almost as equally pronounced, and that's why I was comfortable putting it there. It's also a slightly sweeter citric component, so I'm actually quite happy with it being there at that mark too. It did give the coffee a little bit more depth to it. Level 3s, we will start with the body. I honestly don't know what to make of the body of this coffee, as I think maybe I was expecting a little bit more texture, but this was on the slightly lower side of the level 3. So it had a little bit of it, but not necessarily to the extent I might have expected. Florality, level 3. Yes, I mentioned that there's that red florality, a little bit of spice within this coffee. Definitely would say hibiscus. This one definitely has that for me. Stone fruit, level 3. I've been going back and forth on this one a lot. When I really sit down and think about it, I can kind of pull out some slight fresh stone fruit from it, but it could be the priming effect, as honestly, this coffee just reminds me a lot more of red raspberry seeds. Very much a red coffee forward profile in general. Just kind of depends on how you perceive it and how you want to chart it. So I left it there at the level 3 mark. I'm not entirely convinced I can taste it as much as I'm charting it, but we'll just leave it right there for now. And then the last thing worth discussing, the cleanliness, level 3. Truth be told, there were moments this coffee came out clean enough that I wanted to justify a level 4 mark. And when I initially made this tasting wheel, I put it at a level 4, but I kind of went back and thought this is not quite as clean as most of the washed coffees that we review on this channel that scores that level 4 mark. So I had a very hard time bumping it all the way up there. It's still on the higher side of level 3. That's the best part of this coffee. Most Las Lajas coffees are definitely lower than that. They lack the same sort of clarity and cleanliness that I'm looking for, and this one had it in significantly more measure. So for that reason, I'm quite happy with it at least reaching that level 3 mark. That's a huge positive for this one in general. But for the most part, I think that's everything worth discussing in this tasting wheel. I think it's a pretty accurate representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This is definitely the best Las Lajas coffee I've ever had. I would say I liked it to a certain extent, but I feel like the ceiling for this one is kind of low because this just isn't necessarily my coffee in general. Given that it had a little bit more clarity to it, a little bit more of a candied sweetness, I think this is kind of the best you could do with it when it comes to the types of coffee that I enjoy. So that's huge credits to Mock, because I said, if you can make me enjoy this Las Lajas coffee, then you're leaving a very positive first impression as a coffee roaster. And Mock did a good enough job with this coffee to make me say, hey, there are some really nice positives to a coffee that in the past I have definitely not enjoyed whatsoever. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you do like Las Lajas, I do kind of want to point you in the direction of this one right here, as it does offer more clarity. It's not sacrificing any of those very strong red fruit forward components to it. It is offering a little bit more depth, so it still has that very heavy red forward aspect. So for me, that red raspberry seed, that hibiscus indicator, while at the same time still having some depth like the citric component, on a slightly more sweet but not overbearing manner. And I think the combination of those things makes this a much more easy and drinkable version of this coffee. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Las Lajas Honey Yellow Diamond Processed Costa Rica from Mock Coffee. Thank you for watching.